Russia, during the 19th century, was considered by the most notable observers of the time to be one of the most, if not the most, backward of the European nations, let alone of any colonial power. Whereas Britain, France, Germany, unified under Bismarck in 1871, and even a now destitute Spain had moved towards a more capitalist society with the Industrial Revolution, Russia, under the Czars, had remained a feudal power. Indeed, up until 1905, nearly 80% of the population were peasants in an empire of 126 million people. It is ironic that Marx and his followers would denounce Russia as the least civilized nation in Europe, in the sense of its inevitable progression to the revolution of the proletariat. But at the same time, Russia would produce some of the strictest adherents, in a few cases innovators, to socialist communist thought. However, with Russia's defeat at the hands of the British at the end of the Crimean War in the 1860s, it was apparent to the powers that be that the Russian Empire must industrialize if it wished to become an influential player in the great game. The inter-European struggle for global empire is best characterized by Lord Palmerston's statement that there are no permanent friends nor permanent enemies, there are only permanent interests. The first step in the move towards industrialization would, of course, be the shattering of the inherently feudal aspects of Russian society, namely the institution of serfdom. Serfdom in Tsarist Russia was officially ended under Tsar Alexander II with the emancipation of 1861. Though the serfs were legally free of their lords, many serfs, similar to African slaves in the United States, continued to work on the lands owned by their former masters. However, unlike in the United States, wherein the abolishment of slavery was meant to break the economy of an enemy, the Confederate States of America, in Tsarist Russia, the government took the trouble in reimbursing the lords for the loss in profits suffered by the emancipation. These reimbursements were to be earned and paid for by the newly freed serfs. Some lords had the ex-serfs work the land they worked previously to pay off these redemption payments. Other lords demanded a monetary payment, which was practically impossible to afford in rural Russia, especially those areas in central Russia where the soil was infertile and most of the year was dominated by winter. As such, many peasants became migrant workers, or odgodniki, seasonally moving between their rural communities and factories in the West. In the years immediately before the First World War, approximately 9 million peasants applied for internal passports to do work outside of their native villages. This created a rather unique and unexpected class of persons who were committed both to agriculture and industry, neither proletariat nor peasant in the strict Marxist sense of the terms. However, a large majority of the odgodniki were young men who had been born after the emancipation and were unused to the rigorous discipline of the factory system, and as such were inherently radical, or at least possessed the potential for radicalism. Despite this apparent progressivism, the peasants of Russia were still beholden to their feudal-based local communities, or mers. Each mer operated as a quasi-communist society wherein each household held claim to tracts of commonly held land. The mers would arbitrate disputes between individual members and would enforce semi-egalitarian policies in terms of land, i.e., each household would allocate a strip of land that was to be roughly equal to the strips of land of the other peasants. Each individual peasant was not responsible for the redemption payments. Rather, the various mers were responsible for paying the lords their due. 2. People of the people. Experience has shown that when large bodies of people, whether or not those people are industrial workers, peasants, or odgodniki, are congregated, whether permanently or temporarily, into a relatively concentrated area, i.e. a city or a factory, restlessness and contempt arise. Furthermore, experience has shown that the more industrialized nations become, the broader the base of intellect becomes within that nation. As such, there arose in industrialized Western Russia, as opposed to rural Siberia, which was not known for its birthing of members of the intelligentsia, a contingent of socialists and anarchists, also called narodniks. Narod being translated as people or the people, narodnik would be translated as person of the people. In the same manner, Bolshevik or Bolsheviki would be translated as person of the majority. These people devoted themselves to the overthrow of the autocracy. However, these persons made up a small percentage of Russian society, and as such, these groups never grew much larger than small conspiratorial bands, and as such, political organization on a national scale, as the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks were to be able to achieve later, was not possible at this time. Indeed, these small bands achieved little, and those feats they did achieve, as at face value, appeared to be rather hypocritical and counter to what they claimed to believe. Tsar Alexander II, the very one who emancipated the serfs in 1861, was assassinated by one such group of narodniks, calling themselves the People's Will, Narodnaya Volya, in 1881. In fact, similarly, Peter Stolypin would be assassinated by another group in 1911, despite all of his work for progressive social reform. As such, Marx and other European thinkers viewed these small groups with relative contempt. Along with this urban radicalism, there arose a rural populist movement from 1873 to 74. Incidentally, this populist movement occurred around the same time that the American populist movement began. However, the American movement lasted significantly longer. However, this movement was not genuinely populist in the sense that the peasants themselves were becoming politically active. Rather, it came about due to a large and generally unorganized migration of Western intellectuals, the aforementioned narodniks. The first acknowledged one being Ivan Yakovlevich Orlov, that moved into the rural areas of Imperial Russia in an attempt to foster revolution through such organizations as Zemlya I Volya, Land and Liberty. Known as the Going of the People, this populist movement was resisted not only by the autocracy, who correctly saw it as a dissident movement and promptly made mass arrests, but was also resisted by the peasants themselves, who viewed the narodniks, who were strangers amongst them, with suspicion and as probable class enemies. Thus, shunned by those they wished to liberate and harassed by those they wished to overthrow, the narodniks went back to the underground of the cities in Western Russia, where many such groups began to undertake various acts of terror violence. With the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, a relatively popular czar when compared to his predecessors and his successors, the narodniks lost the sympathies of most of the population of Russia. Some peasants believed that it had been a conspiracy among the lords to assassinate the Tsar for emancipating the serfs. Further, there were several anti-Semitic and thus anti-intelligentsia and anti-narodnik pogroms in Ukraine. Soon thereafter, there was a split within the narodniks. Populists, or social revolutionaries, on the one hand, who wished to maintain the Mir as an example of an ideal communist institution. As Alexander Herzen said, the life of the Russian peasantry has hitherto been confined to the commune. It is only in relation to the commune and its members that the peasant recognizes that he has rights and duties. The other split were the Marxists, who saw the Mir as inherently corrupted by the influence of the autocracy. Indeed, Marx himself described the Mir as Russian autocracy turned upside down, and who advocated the economic development of the country, and as such, the destruction of the Mir. With the narodniks divided on what to do, the Marxists began to focus their efforts towards gaining the support of the proletariat, seeing the peasantry as veritable collaborators with the autocracy. So, in 1898, the Social Democratic Labor Party was founded, Similarly, the Populists founded the Social Revolutionary Party in 1901. With less of an emphasis upon the nationalist sentimentalities of the Populists and more of a focus upon the international struggle of the worker everywhere. Further, various Marxists within the country realized that their goals could not be achieved by revolutionary violence alone. Rather, paradoxically, they had to support and even accelerate the government's movement towards the advocacy of capitalism. In Marxist terms, capitalism was, by necessity, the rung below socialism on the ladder of social progress. As such, capitalism was seen by these groups of Marxists to be progressive, at least when compared to feudalism and the autocracy. And as such, its attainment was required before the total socialist revolution could be achieved. For this reason alone, the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, deemed the Marxists to be less of a threat in terms of violence, since the Marxists saw the use of revolutionary terror violence as laughable and counterproductive. It was rarely used within their ranks. So they were seen as less violent than their populist cousins. But in terms of ultimate long-term goals, the Marxists were far more radical, i.e., the requisite destruction of the Mir for social progress. However, not all was at peace within the ranks of the Marxists. In fact, the relations between the various ideologies that were incorporated into the Social Democratic Labor Party was far from perfect, as evidenced by the three-way split that began during the Second Party Congress held in London in 1903 and ultimately culminated at the end of 1917. Just as the original, albeit unorganized groups of Narodniks were split between moderates, populists, and hardliners, Marxists and Social Democrats, so too were the Marxists split between softliners, constitutional Democrats or cadets, moderates, Social Democrats or Mensheviks, and hardline radicals, communists or Bolsheviks. This ideological fragmentation was unprecedented in European radicalism, and its only viable comparison would be that of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 1980s to the 2000s. Ironically, they were fighting against the invading Soviet Union. Further, this fragmentation would ultimately precipitate the violence and chaos of the post-Tsarist years. The Socialist Schism. The first division occurred between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks when exiled leaders of the Social Democratic Labor Party met in London to hold the Second Party Congress in 1903. It should be noted that even though the Okhrana considered the Marxists to be less of an immediate threat than the populists, nevertheless, political parties in general were illegal in Tsarist Russia, and as such, their leadership lived, for the most part, in self-imposed exile in Western Europe. The initial disagreement between the two, which could eventually blossom into bloody conflict after the fall of the Kerensky government, was over the tactics of how the party was to gain power. A rather trite argument when one reflects upon it, but one, nonetheless, that would come to define the two parties during the Civil War. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Illyich Ulyanov, using the assumed name Lenin, stressed that the party be focused upon the propagation of a revolutionary vanguard or revolutionary elite, whose purpose it was to educate and radically politicize the proletariat. As Lenin wrote in August of 1917, it is our first task to resuscitate the real teachings of Marx. For this revolutionary vanguard to be possible, the organization of the party, by necessity, had to be highly centralized, highly exclusive, and highly militant. Militant primarily in the ideological and rhetorical sense, not necessarily, though some were willing, militant in the sense of terror violence. Further, the Bolsheviks held that one could not simply wait for the proletarian revolution to occur, for the process of unconscious class struggle would merely result in trade unionism, compromise, and contentment, rather than the desired radicalism. Lenin wrote in 1923, "The workers would like to build a better apparatus for us, but they do not know how. They cannot build one. They have not yet developed the culture required for this, and it is culture that is required. Although this comment is specifically oriented against anti-Bolshevik sentiments that were beginning to arise among the proletariat in the early 1920s, the quote is still applicable to the Bolshevism of 1903. Rather than wait, the revolutionary vanguard had to take matters into their own hands and actually lead the proletariat into the fray, both ideologically and physically. As Lenin once said, "The only serious organizational principle the active workers of our movement can accept is strict secrecy, strict selection of members, and the training of professional revolutionaries." Further, Lenin advised his followers to agree to any and every sacrifice, and even to resort to all sorts of devices, maneuvers, and illegal methods to evasion and subterfuge in order to penetrate the trade unions, to remain in them, and to carry on the communist work in them at all costs. The Mensheviks, on the other hand, wanted to be more democratic. They did not stress, as the Bolsheviks had, for a dictatorship of the proletariat. And as such, the Mensheviks were more open to compromise and more willing to open membership in the party to everyone. In a word, they were more liberal than their radical brethren. As such, with this more open attitude, the Mensheviks, despite their name meaning minority, a label that was slapped onto them by the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks had the majority of support at the Congress, whereas the Bolsheviks, their name conversely meaning majority, held the minority. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, infuriated at being rebuffed, calling their once allies petty bourgeois Democrats and sham socialists who replaced the class struggle by dreams of class harmony, split from the Social Democratic Labor Party and formed the Communist Party of Russia, later the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. After such rebukes and such violent arguments, no reconciliation was possible between the two groups of Marxists, and they agreed upon little thereafter. As Lenin himself said later in 1921, "For public manifestations of Menshevism, our revolutionary courts must pass the death sentence. Otherwise, they are not our courts, but God knows what." Part 3. Expanding the Empire. A mere 4 decades after the emancipation of the serfs and the creation of the Othodniki, the Tsarist Russia was making good progress in its modernization, as evidenced by the steady industrialization of its economy, i.e., the Putilov metalworks in St. Petersburg or the metallurgical plants in Donbass, and the modernization of its military, i.e., the Baltic Fleet. However, Tsarist Russia was still no Great Britain or United States in terms of total productivity and modernity. But despite this slight increase in material wealth, Russian nationalist sentiments within the populace were still weak, especially with the naysaying of the Narodniks. But as history has shown, nothing boosts one's faith in one's government like an us versus them dilemma, such as a war. But the question was, which nation should the Russian Empire engage? Imperial Japan was a slowly rising star in the Pacific. Soon after Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy opened up the nation's ports in 1854, and as such opened up the previously isolationist nation to various Western innovations, steamships, rifles, and other things necessary for a modern and industrially based military. The empire of the rising sun was steadily on the ascendance. The Russian building of a railway across Manchuria to Vladivostok appeared to threaten the gains made by Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95. As such, the Japanese Navy opened fire upon the Russian-controlled Chinese city of Port Arthur in 1904. Thus, with an aggressive enemy, whatever the intentions of Russia were to build the previously mentioned railroad, nevertheless, it cannot be denied that the Japanese started the fight. With an aggressive enemy to the east, an enemy that not only threatened Russian territory, but also was of a quote-unquote oriental stock, Tsarist Russia was able to rally nationalist sentiments and deployed its armies from the west across the unfinished Trans-Siberian Railroad to engage Japanese armies in Manchuria. Further, the Russian Navy sent the Baltic Fleet, the pride and joy of the Russian Empire and the envy of Eastern Europe, halfway around the world to do battle with Imperial Japan. Any observer of geopolitics at the time would have predicted the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War as follows. The Russian Empire, a Western, albeit slightly backward, power, would obviously defeat the armies of the Japanese, an Eastern and Oriental power, by the sheer virtue that the former was superior to the latter. This was not the case in the least. Russian troops in the Battle of Mukden were defeated hands down. The Baltic Fleet, after spending months at sea, was completely destroyed or captured after a single engagement with the Japanese at the Tsushima Strait. Russia suffered the most embarrassing defeat in its military history, made worse by losing to an Asian nation. This humiliation is reflected in the Treaty of Portsmouth, wherein Russia never actually acknowledged Japan as the victor, as was customary in the peace treaties negotiated between European nations. Part 4. The failure of 1905. But long before peace was declared, as Russian troops died en masse on the front lines, the previously nationalistic populace, especially the workers, the otohniki of western cities like St. Petersburg, began to grow weary of the war. In 1904, only a few months after the war had begun, there arose a movement among professional organizations and even the nobility for the institution of constitutional reforms within Tsarist Russia. This movement, led predominantly by Peter Struve, was rather peaceful, focusing mainly upon a banquet campaign or private meetings of gentlemen and businessmen wherein politics would be discussed. These peaceful pressures for reform were not limited to the ranks of the nobility, or even taken up by various narodniks. These campaigns, although punctuated by terror violence caused by individual radicals, were, for the most part, entirely peaceful. The March of Industrial Workers and their families, led by Father George Gapon, a renegade priest, on January 9, 1905, to the steps of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, was equally as peaceful as the movement started by Peter Struve. The group, wishing to peaceably express their economic concerns, nevertheless held banners that praised the Czar, was fired upon by panicked imperial guards. Bloody Sunday left 1,000 innocent men, women, and children dead, and would bring to the fore the opportunity the Russian radicals had been waiting for decades. The first Russian Revolution, for the most part, went against the predictions made by Marx, insofar as its attempt was far too early in the progress of the globe. According to Marx, the entire globe had to first become capitalist before it could become socialist, and that the proletariat revolution would be an international affair, since working men have no country. Quote, united action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. Further, the international development of capitalism implies the international character of the proletarian revolution. Though the revolution was as impromptu as Marx expected it to be, it was still only on a national scale, and further, it involved far more persons than just the proletariat. Practically everyone seemed to be rebelling. Students, farmers, workers, and by extension the quasi-union workers from groups known as Soviets, anarchists, populists, liberals, soldiers, sailors, and nationalists in non-Russian regions of the empire. There was no organization of any sort to the rebellion, but multiple groups claimed ownership of the movement. However, this organizational decentralization and political fragmentation would ultimately be the death blow to the 1905 revolution. It seemed that the pot had finally boiled over, and there was little for the autocracy to do in response, what with the imperial armies clashing against the Japanese thousands of miles away, while riots roiled in the streets of the capital. Only with the Treaty of Portsmouth, a full 8 months after Bloody Sunday pushed Tsarist Russia near the brink, did the necessary troops become available to put down the rebellions. But ultimately, since it would have taken months to return the soldiers to the west by train, the solution to the overflowing pot was not to turn up the heat, but rather to crack the lid. After the disastrous failure of the 1905 revolution, few observers of international events, including Lenin himself, during his self-imposed exile in Western Europe, Lenin said, "I do not expect to live to see the revolution." No one would have expected that such a startling turnaround in Tsarist Russia a mere 12 years later. However, this doubt as to the success of a subsequent revolution was not due to the brutality of the Tsarist state after 1905, rather because of its steady liberalization. Under the guidance of Peter Stolypin, one of the Tsar's advisors, the livelihoods of workers and peasants alike were improved as more political powers were extended to them in the form of zemstvos, or local legislative groups. Along with the zemstvos, Nicholas II, much to the criticism of his autocratic allies, who thought the regime would be better off to crack down on the peasants, established a parliament, or Duma. The Duma was more for appearances than for any actual power. It was dissolved twice by the Czar, and any time it gained any influence, it was quickly taken over by the nobility. As such, both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, during one of the few times that they agreed with each other, rejected the Duma as a fruitless and token gift. However, within the Social Democratic Labor Party, saw this as the opportunity needed to gain actual democratic progress in Tsarist Russia. These opportunists, petty bourgeois Democrats, as Lenin would call them, split with the Mensheviks and became constitutional Democrats. Once again, the Narodniks were split along ideological lines of moderation and radicalism. The Cadets, as they were nicknamed, quickly gained the majority in the sham parliament. Despite its false powers of legislation, the Duma nevertheless worked to help diffuse the tension of the revolution in Tsarist Russia for a time. Along with these widening political freedoms, property rights were also extended to those peasants who wished to leave the Mir. In fact, between 1907 and 1916, 6.2 million out of 16 million eligible families applied for legal separation from the Mir, thus beginning the veritable destruction of a quasi-communist aspect of Russian society, to the dismay of the populists. However, the destruction of the Mir would not be completed by the autocracy, but rather, ironically, by the Bolsheviks and their efforts at collectivized farming. In this way, Nicholas II and his various policies of reform was far more effective in putting down the rebellion than all the troops of the imperial army. The primary fear of the Narodniks, the Bolsheviks in particular, at this time, was not the okhrana or execution, but rather that if these government reforms were to continue, it would depoliticize the lower classes and thus sap them of their revolutionary potential. In short, one does not rebel against a good government. For this reason, for depriving the Narodniks the glory of improving the lives of the lower classes, Peter Stolypin was assassinated at a theater in Kiev in 1911. His assassination, however, did not solve the problem of the steady depoliticization of the proletariat, peasantry, and the odchodniki. In an ever-increasingly affluent and, relatively, when compared to what Tsarist Russia was previously, free society. World War I would solve that problem for the Narodniks. Part 5. The Socialists break through. The First World War was a unique experience in European history. It certainly was not the first international conflict they experienced. The 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, and the final stages of the American Revolution all divided the European nations. But they were all pre-industrial affairs, and the complete destruction of cities and nations wrought by mass-produced arms and the millions of young men in the regular armies was not present nor possible until the early 20th century. This devastation was also caused by a rather profound ignorance of the capabilities of early 20th century armies, despite the fact that they had seen the results of the Russo-Japanese War a mere 9 years earlier. The generals in command continued to use 19th century tactics and strategies. However, they quickly found that troop formations are not effective against minefields and machine gun nests. As a result, the war that every side expected to be over by the Christmas of 1914 lasted until November 1918, with over 16 million civilians and soldiers dead and 20 million wounded. About 1,700,000 of the dead being Russian. In the years immediately before the war, and in the initial months, there was, throughout Europe, Russia included, a profound sense of nationalism and national duty, even among the Socialists, whose major claim to fame was internationalist duty to mankind as a whole. These sentiments reigned supreme. Many Socialists saw it as a war to break the imperialist stranglehold of the world. British Socialists saw it as a breaking of the German and Austrian empires. German Socialists saw it as breaking the French and British empires. German writer Karl Pribram wrote of the war, "The fight against the capitalist order, again, according to this view, is a continuation of the war against the Entente, Britain, France, Russia, with the weapons of the spirit and of economic organization, the way which leads to practical socialism, a return of the German people to their best and noblest traditions." Similarly, the English professor Edward Hallett Carr wrote sometime after the war, "The revolution which began in the last war, which has been the driving force of every significant political movement in the last 20 years, a revolution against the predominant ideas of the 19th century, liberal democracy, national self-determination, and laissez-faire economics." Carr also went on to write, "The victors, England, France, America, lost the peace, and Soviet Russia and Germany won it, because the former continued to preach and in part to apply the once valid but now disruptive ideals of the rights of nations and laissez-faire capitalism, whereas the latter, consciously or unconsciously, borne forward on the tide of the 20th century, were striving to build up the world in larger units under centralized planning and control." Indeed, the only naysayers in any country during this brief time were the Bolsheviks and, ironically enough, American socialists, who saw both sides of the conflict as having imperialist ambitions and, as such, must not be fought. The Mensheviks agreed with the Bolsheviks on the imperialist nature of the war, but only insofar as an aggressive war, i.e. the active conquest of enemy territory, was imperialist, but that a defensive war would not be imperialist, insofar as it was acting against the imperialist ambitions of Russia's enemies. As such, the Mensheviks, at least later on, would support the war, but only if it was defensive in nature, whereas the Bolsheviks were against the war no matter what. However, the Bolsheviks were practical enough to see the war as helping in advancing their cause against the autocracy at home, insofar as war weariness would translate to revolutionary zeal. Therefore, all they could hope for was a major loss in the war to further delegitimize the Tsar. Every Russian military victory in World War I was a Bolshevik propaganda defeat, and vice versa. The war shattered entire industrial sectors of nations, crippling the economies of Europe. This crippling had a much more drastic effect in Tsarist Russia, what with its extreme ideological fragmentation, than in any of the other warring nations. This devastation and political fragmentation was only accentuated by the ineptitude of the autocracy. For whatever reason, members of the European nobility seemed to believe that just because one's ancestor was a great commander, or that because one donned the uniform, automatically made one a great commander. As such, the officer corps of the militaries throughout Europe were built up not by merit, but rather by birthright. Nobles, lords, and barons made up the entirety of the upper echelons of officers throughout Europe. Tsar Nicholas II was not immune to this, making himself the commander-in-chief of Russian forces. With Nicholas II away at the front, managing the affairs of the armed forces, domestic affairs were left in the hands of Tsarina Alexandra and her close advisor Rasputin. It is safe to say that Nicholas II was better at commanding troops than Alexandra was at running a nation. As Pavel Milyukov, a cadet in the Fourth Duma, said in a speech criticizing Alexandra, "Is this stupidity or is it treason?" There was further distrust of the Tsarina amongst a vehemently nationalist populace during an international war, thanks to the fact that Alexandra was a German princess by birth, and as such considered to be a foreign agent by many. Part 6. The Russian Revolution. In late February 1917, a demonstration for International Women's Day in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, during the war, sparked, and was precipitated by bread shortages, a long series of protests, strikes, and lockouts throughout the city during the last week of February. When the city police proved to be ineffective in containing the impromptu movement, troops from the Petrograd garrison were mobilized. The soldiers of the garrison, which was made up almost entirely of drafted persons, rather than containing the protesters, mingled with them and lost the initiative to break the riot. By the 28th of that month, the crowd, with shouts of "Down with the Tsar" on their lips, had taken control of all the railway stations, the artillery supplies of the local garrison, and the entire city. The February days in Petrograd were in themselves a microcosm of Russian society as a whole. Workers turned on their managers, enlisted men mutinied against their officers. All in all, Russian society during these months was in the midst of turbulent and violent change. With the rioters in control of Petrograd and the fleeing of the Tsar's advisors, the game was up. With millions dead in a war few supported, famine in the country, and riots in the cities, the autocracy could no longer hold firm against a bitter and revolutionary populace. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, which was then offered to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who declined it. Russia, as of March 17, 1917, had no monarch. The only institutionalized political power that remained was the faltering administrative power of the Fourth Duma, which was operating against the now defunct will of the monarchy. The Duma, when it became apparent to that the autocracy would soon come to an end, formed a self-appointed provisional government under Prince Lvov on March 14, 1917, that would help in the process of shifting from a monarchy to a republic. Prince Lvov once said, "The spirit of the Russian people has shown itself, of its own accord, to be a universally democratic spirit. It is a spirit that seeks not only to dissolve into universal democracy, but also to lead the way proudly down the path first marked out by the French Revolution toward liberty, equality, and fraternity." However, the provisional government was not the only source of political influence in post-Tsarist, pre-Bolshevik Russia. The various Soviets of Petrograd, the iron workers, the factory workers, etc., unified themselves into the Petrograd Soviet, which had taken up its headquarters in the Tauride Palace and was in session when the provisional government was formed. But the Soviets, made up of mainly Mensheviks, were quicker in the assertion of their authority than the provisional government, by a day, with the issuance of Order Number 1, which called for the immediate democratization of the army through the institutionalization of soldiers' committees, thus the destruction of the officer corps as an entity, as they were seen as bourgeois, and the assertion of the Soviets' authority on all military policies. Thus, as will happen whenever two separate entities claim jurisdiction over the same area, various persons will pledge their loyalties to a given side, and usually conflict will occur. However, the provisional government and the Soviet did not launch attacks upon one another, which would be a precedent when that would not be followed later on. But rather, they both recognized the fragile state of their country was in, and as such, they decided it would be better to work together. As such, a bicameral government was unintentionally and spontaneously formed between the Soviet and the provisional government, built entirely upon a mutual understanding between them. The enlisted men in the army would only listen to the Soviet, and the officers would only listen to the provisional government. As such, in order to have a unified military, the two had to work together to earn the loyalties of both officers and soldiers. In order to facilitate this agreement, Alexander Kerensky, both a socialist and a member of the provisional government, acted as a liaison between the two groups. However, it quickly became apparent that the Soviets held the upper hand in the seemingly symbiotic relationship. As War Minister Guchkov said, "The provisional government exists only so long as it is permitted by the Soviet." As more people realized the true nature of this relationship, such militant slogans as "all power to the Soviets" began to arise. The Bolsheviks from the beginning had called the provisional government reactionary and acting in contradistinction to the ideals fought for in the two revolutions, and they were also the only ones that rallied support against Kornilov's coup. Soviets throughout Russia, particularly in Petrograd and Moscow, lent their support to Lenin and his Communist Party. For the first time, and debatably the last, since the abdication of the Czar, the Bolsheviks held a majority. This is to say that the Bolsheviks held a majority of support from the proletariat, so i.e. industrial workers and soldiers, and not necessarily a majority of the Russian populace as a whole. Indeed, at the start of World War I, only 3% of the working class was politically active. Soviet would soon become synonymous with Bolshevik. For this reason, in the April of 1919, the anarchist Nabyt Congress in Ukraine declared in a resolution that it opposed all participation in the Soviets, which have become purely political organs organized on an authoritarian, centralist, statist basis. Part 9. The Coup of 17. The provisional government had become anemic and weak and ruled only on paper. The Soviets had bolstered their strength and influence and had been reinfused with a revolutionary vitality brought to them by the Bolsheviks. To many, the collapse of the dual power system was the inevitable rise of the Soviets to assume total control was imminent. None were as adamant for the forcible ascension of the Soviets, and by extension, the Bolsheviks, as Lenin. Though Lenin vehemently supported the overthrow of Kerensky and the provisional government, understandable since he had spent much of his life in exile and was now closer than ever to actually attaining the power he sought, other members of the Bolshevik leadership, namely Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, were opposed to the move, as it would be just as contradictory to the revolution as Kornilov's coup. Once again, the possibility for an ideological schism between the radicals and the moderates within a political party seemed to be imminent. Trotsky, now a Bolshevik, Stalin, and a majority of the Central Committee of the party supported Lenin's call to action. On the eve of October 24th, 1917, before the Constituent Assembly was to convene in Petrograd, members of the Bolshevik-dominated Revolutionary Military Committee, an offshoot of the Petrograd Soviet, whose duty was to organize resistance to counter-revolution after the Kornilov affair, and a contingent of soldiers from the Petrograd garrison set to work, seizing telephone exchanges, railway stations, and power plants throughout the city. The Bolshevik-dominated Krogstad fleet also contributed to the takeover when a warship, the battleship Aurora, leveled its guns on Kerensky's seat of government in the White Palace and opened fire. Whereas the Bolsheviks found many volunteers to conduct the coup d'etat, the provisional government could find few to serve in the defense of a republic many saw as rotten and corrupt. As a result, the Bolshevik seizure of power was relatively bloodless, and most of the fighting was contained to the taking of the Winter Palace. Kerensky was forced to flee from the country. He arrived in the United States and remained there until his death in 1970. The provisional government had been toppled in a night, and in its place stood the Council of People's Commissars. Lenin was, naturally, the head of this organization. Trotsky was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Joseph Stalin was the Minister of Nationalities. The next day, Lenin came out of hiding and addressed the Congress of Soviets. The Congress, at Lenin's behest, passed 2 resolutions. The first mandated an end to the conflict with Germany, which would yield the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The second mandated the abolishment of landlord property, which would eventually culminate in the destruction of the kulaks in the 1920s and the collectivization of the farmland in the 1930s. Although the Bolsheviks tried to win their support in the first days after the coup with the passing of the Decree on Land, which openly declared that all right of property regarding the land is hereby abolished without indemnity, and all land is hereby put at the disposal of local agrarian committees for redistribution. Despite this attempt to appease the peasantry, the Greens nevertheless fought back against the Reds. The Bolsheviks, on their first day in power, had made good on the promises of peace and land. But once again, to the chagrin of the Russian people, the fighters of the revolution would betray it. For the first days of the coup would be a foreshadowing of what was to come in later years. Beginning on October 26, a number of commissars of the Revolutionary Military Council, acting independently of orders from the Bolshevik Central Committee, closed 7 of the capital's principal newspapers, took control of radio and telegraph stations, set up a project for the requisitioning of apartments and privately owned cars, and forbidding of counter-revolutionary tactics. These actions were retroactively legalized a few days later. Further, on November 28th, Lenin signed a decree stating that all leaders of the Constitutional Democratic Party, a party filled with enemies of the people, are hereby to be considered outlaws and are to be arrested immediately and brought before a revolutionary court. Part 10. Civil War. Russia still claimed to be a republic, and as such elections were held for the Constituent Assembly in January of 1918. 36 million people voted in the election, of which the Bolsheviks received around 9 million votes. The Mensheviks received about 21 million votes. The Bolsheviks had lost by a landslide. And yet, though they accused both the provisional government of corruption and the degradation of the revolutionary ideals of equality and democracy, the Bolsheviks refused to give up the reins of power. As Trotsky put it years afterwards, the proletariat cannot conquer power within the legal framework enacted by the bourgeoisie. Ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Dropping all pretense of democracy in the government, the Bolsheviks revoked the suffrage of persons of bourgeois background or heritage and only gave proletariats any say in the processes of government. As Felix Dzerzhinsky of the Revolutionary Military Council explained, through Bolshevism, it is the masses who speak and who act against their class enemy, against the enemies of the people. We are here only to channel and direct the hate and the legitimate desire for revenge of the oppressed against their oppressors. From that moment onward, peace between the various ideologies of post-Tsarist Russia, the whites, the Mensheviks, the cadets, the Greens, the populists, the anarchists, peace was no longer possible. Quite surprisingly, in March of 1918, the sailors of the ever-radical Krogstad fleet, who had been notoriously pro-Bolshevik, took up arms to fight against what they perceived to be the Bolshevik betrayal of the revolution. They themselves were crushed. As the newspaper Krasnaya Gazeta wrote shortly after an attempt on Lenin's life in 1918, "Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. For the blood of Lenin, let there be floods of blood of the bourgeoisie, more blood as much as possible." Having already foreseen possible resistance to the rule of the proletariat, especially considering that both Prince Lvov and Kerensky had been resisted, the Bolsheviks had established on December 20th, 1917, a group known as the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. The Cheka, as an organization, was originally founded to 1. Suppress and liquidate any act or attempted act of counter-revolutionary activity or sabotage, whatever its origin, anywhere on Russian soil. 2. To bring all saboteurs and counter-revolutionaries before a revolutionary court. The Cheka's actions quickly became a politically motivated secret police force similar to the Okhrana. Using such tactics as mass arrest, summary justice, executions, and hostage-taking, the Cheka, the forefathers of the KGB, would become the black-gloved fist of the Bolsheviks. Relentless, unsympathetic, and indiscriminate. Quote, "We must make use of determined comrades, solid, hard men without pity, who are ready to sacrifice everything for the sake of the revolution. We have no concern about justice at this hour. We are at war," unquote. The Cheka between 1918 and 1919 shot at least 8,389 people without trial, and they further arrested 87,000 more. During one raid, the Cheka surrounded Petrograd's main shopping street, Nevsk Prospekt, and summarily arrested everyone without a party card or a certificate proving that they worked for a government institution. Quote, "We don't make war against any people in particular," unquote. Martin Latzis, a chief of the Cheka, said in a set of orders in November 1918, "We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. In your investigations, don't look for documents and pieces of evidence about what the defendant has done, whether in deed or in speaking or acting against the Soviet authority. The first question you should ask him is what class he comes from. What are his roots, his education, his training, and his occupation?" If the Cheka was the black-gloved fist of the Bolshevik Party, then the Red Army was its iron heel. Forged by the Council of People's Commissars and led by Leon Trotsky, the Red Army during the Civil War employed nearly 500,000 members of the Communist Party. Veterans from factories, the old army and fleet, the infamous Red Guards, they were the backbone of the entire army. Further, they recruited 5 million conscripts, mostly peasants. The proletariat lent its support to the Bolsheviks with their adamant anti-bourgeois, anti-autocratic, anti-compromise stance. The middle and upper classes backed the whites with their anti-proletariat and pro-Tsarist stance. The peasantry, making up a vast majority of Russia, had nowhere to go. They were stuck in the middle. For them, the only real difference between Red Terror and White Terror was that one broke your nose with the left hand, while the other broke your nose with the right. As a result, many peasants formed their own armies, the so-called Green Armies. Even though the Bolsheviks were outnumbered and hence outgunned by the whites, the Bolsheviks were able to win out against their enemies thanks to 2 factors. First, the Red Army had more collective experience than their White Army counterparts. The ranks of the Red Army were made up of primarily persons with backgrounds of a violent or revolutionary, or both, nature. From the remaining loyal sailors of the Krogstad fleet to the workers of the Petrograd Soviet to 50,000 former Tsarist officers. Second, there were too many commanders of varying ideologies within the whites for them to ever have been centralized and organized. Ironically, the autocrats suffered the same problem the Narodniks suffered in 1905, whereas the Bolsheviks had always been a highly centralized and highly disciplined party. Ultimately, the dissenters in Russia, the whites, the Mensheviks, the cadets, the Greens, the populists, the anarchists, were all dealt decisive and overwhelming blows from which they were unable to recover, militarily, ideologically, and politically. The Mensheviks were scattered. The various regions that had declared independence had been brought back in, and the very embodiment of the autocracy, Tsar Nicholas II, lay dead in a basement with his family in a house in the Urals. All that was left up to debate within the ranks of the Bolsheviks was what to do when the dust settled. Part 11, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Quote, "The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, an organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasants, the petty bourgeois, the semi-proletarians, in the work of organizing a socialist economy." So said Lenin. The Bolsheviks quickly established this organization of violence with the establishment of the northern camps of special significance in northwestern Russia in the early 1920s, and the subsequent deportation of kontriks, counter-revolutionaries, and vragi naroda, enemies of the people, to forced labor camps in the Solovetsky archipelago, all marked the veritable end of the proletarian revolution and of the civil war in Russia. With the triumph of the Bolsheviks, the subjugation of the other political parties in post-Tsarist Russia through the institution of the Cheka, and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat under Lenin and the Bolsheviks, something unique and highly unexpected had been achieved: the union of Soviet Socialist republics. The Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagery would help to maintain the victory of the Bolsheviks through the destruction of any person or group who would threaten the stability of the state. The gulags would become communist concentration camps. Ultimately, millions would be terrorized, subjugated, starved, tortured, and executed, all in the name of socialist brotherhood. Quote, "There were no restrictions when the time came for the iron fist of the dictatorship of the proletariat to smite its foe," unquote. Despite the paradox of preaching love and brotherhood whilst stepping on the throats of those who speak against you, Vladimir Lenin once stated simply that you can't make omelets without breaking eggs, a line which Vladimir Bukovsky retorted, saying that he had seen the broken eggs, but no one he knew had ever tasted the omelet.